Good evening. My name is Michael Halpenny. I'm a member of the Trade Unionists for a New and United Ireland group, and this is part of our national roadshow of pushing forward the debate on a united Ireland and also the position of workers within a new and united Ireland. There was one thing that the recent pandemic crisis has pointed up, and that is the glaring inequalities in Irish society, north and south of the border. While at the one hand, people are rightly applauding the workers in the front line and also in support who have kept the show on the road and kept us safe. What hasn't really been highlighted is the precarious situation that many of them find themselves in, with the lack of proper terms and conditions of employment. And when all the dust hopefully settles on the immediate pandemic crisis, that particular crisis will still exist. And our view is that only in a new situation, in a new normality, can we possibly address those issues of inequality, of working conditions, and of true respect for workers in the workplace. Our speakers tonight are going to push that debate forward. Firstly, we have Jerry Murphy. He's president of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and also he is Northern Secretary of the Irish National Teachers Organisation. Secondly, we have Patricia McKeown, who's a regional secretary of Unison and a past president of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And then we have Martina Devlin, who's a Dublin-based journalist and author, and who has been part of the broad debate on a new future for this island. First of all, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to make some opening remarks, and then we will have a number of questions to discuss with them. And we hope to be through this in about 45 minutes. Our first speaker this evening is Patricia McKeown, who is the Northern Secretary of Unison, a trade union in the North, and who has a vast experience of working with people in the health service.
Thank you, Mick. I want to start with where we are just now. In Ireland, north and south, both the numbers of deaths and the numbers of newly positive cases are low. We need to see increased efforts until control is assured and there is, in effect, a COVID-free island of Ireland. An all-island approach to the pandemic should immediately be adopted using the Memorandum of Understanding. As we achieve full control, travel restrictions should be reconsidered alongside the resumption of social and economic activity. It seems sensible that travel restrictions between the islands should be instituted on public health grounds until all are COVID-free, although Scotland may achieve COVID-free status relatively soon. This is a sensible public health solution, but like everything else on the island, constitutional politics impacts. It is now widely accepted that it's much harder to maintain a decent model of public health in an unequal but affluent society. COVID-19 has exposed the impact of that inequality in the starkest way. Turns out that fundamental human rights really do matter to the people. Health and social care, food and shelter, education, childcare, decent public services, a clean and safe environment, decent work, and social security. On an island of 6 million people with shocking health inequalities linked directly to poverty and discrimination, we have the opportunity to act to turn this around now. The single health system is an obvious solution. It requires political will and a much larger portion of GDP or budget spend. We shouldn't settle for anything less than an integrated public health and social services system, taxation-based and built on the founding principles of the National Health Service. The health and well-being of the people should not be a business built on profit. We have instead a blatant two-tier system in the South, which makes insurance companies and private medicine rich. There's been little movement on the Sláintecare website since 2019, and past attempts to develop a universal public health system quickly came to grief. The public health system in the North has been the subject of attack since its foundation. For the past 30-odd years, it has been deliberately starved of resources, kept in a constant state of disorganisation, reviewed to the point of exhaustion, and challenged by privatisation. It is the target of a greedy elite who seek to enrich themselves at the expense of the health of the people, and in particular those who can least afford to pay. The assault was primarily developed by Thatcherism and refined by subsequent Tory and Labour governments, and then by that much of the attack has been held at bay by a combination of direct action by health workers, their unions, and a public which cares passionately about the NHS is a good place to start. In both parts of the island, health workers were recently pushed to industrial action. Close on its heels came COVID-19. Across Ireland, health workers have been hailed as heroes. But memories are short, and there will be attempts to revert to the norm or worse. There has been cooperation between both health systems for over 20 years on, for example, primary care and other services in border areas, some low-volume specialist services provided in a single location, such as paediatric heart surgery in Dublin, and there have been waiting list initiatives. But the time is now for us to consider what's meant by an all-island health service. How would it be different to what we have now? Would it cover the social determinants of health inequalities? Would it fully integrate services, include social care, primary care, prescriptions, mental health, dentistry, etc.? Currently, this would need a shared governance system and shared funding. Would a patient be entitled to the same services anywhere on the island? We could start with something more phased, smaller steps towards an all-island service. We'd stick with the EU standards, North and South. We could try to move towards more flexible staffing, harmonised job qualifications, terms and conditions. Rather than cover everything, we could start with some staff groups. This is difficult work. It needs dedicated people. We could train more people on an all-island basis. Maybe a training institute with local facilities sharing specialist skills. We can create fora where ideas and good practice can be shared. There's a deep end GP project in the South. We need it in the North too. We could have shared work on health inequalities and on procurement. We could develop other projects, for example, a shared project spanning health, veterinary, agriculture, the drug industry. All of this is possible. It requires champions and the democratic engagement of the people to push governments down the right road. Cuba drew on the NHS as a model for its own world-leading health service. Our small island, a variant of the Cuban model, would change our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Now, health is one of the major planks within the Irish Congress of Trade Unions new document called No Going Back. And I'd ask Jerry if he would mind spending some time on outlining the other provisions within the Congress document.
Thank you, Mick. There's a major change underway inside the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, a change which is being reflected at secretariat and executive levels within the Congress, but also it's reflecting more broadly a wider debate going on inside the movement and in Irish society at all levels concerning the reunification of the island. That change I'm talking about is reflected in the ICTU's vision for post-COVID Ireland contained in the No Going Back document. It spells out the movement's view on how the economies in both jurisdictions should be recast or need to be recast in the time ahead. I suggest that no going back represents a breaking out of a mindset, which Dermot Farragher referred to recently in an op-ed piece for the Irish Times as, a compartmentalized mindset. And no going back, I think, sees the Irish trade union movement stepping out of that mindset. And while no going back doesn't explicitly call for a reunification of the island, it is, in my view, implicit in the document and what it says. The work of a generation of trade unionists who were committed to moving Congress to a position where it was prepared to take a view on the national question, and more importantly, to approach the provision of policies on an all-Ireland basis, has finally begun to see a return, and we owe those people a huge debt. The document No Going Back also represents a significant change in presentational style for Congress. It's a result of a collaboration between the senior officers of Congress and the Nevin Economic Research Institute. And together they've produced an accessible document which outlines in a coherent and rational way the way forward for the island in a single economic framework. Just as importantly, it does so in a way which simply doesn't describe the challenges facing workers and their families, but offers solutions. And key, it points to how the necessary change would be funded. And these funding proposals are not the lazy go-to slash and burn favoured by the neoliberals, but rather funding solutions based on fairness and justice for all. The key economic areas of social life that affect every worker and their families are addressed. The document is clear from the immediate impact of the pandemic that government and its organs across the Republic and the Northern Statelet can act quickly and can act differently to address the needs of society and economy. Across both jurisdictions, the relationship between state, business and the workers has been fundamentally changed. In light of this change, it's now time not only to reassess the economic models on the island, but to accept the workers' voice needs to be heard more strongly in designing and building a post-COVID Ireland. No Going Back advocates that. In presenting an alternative vision, Congress is bullish that a strong recovery can be made. No Going Back calls for public spending via a stimulus programme to address, in the first instances, the housing emergency, which is an island-wide issue, and a second island-wide imperative, the need to transition to a carbon-free future. This cannot be done without care being taken to ensure that our societal infrastructure is protected and strengthened also. The pandemic has illustrated for those who didn't know or previously refused to accept that the level of social protection available has been inadequate in both jurisdictions. As the pandemic here recedes, hopefully, we cannot allow those in power to simply allow our welfare systems to revert to pre-COVID inadequate defaults. Our objective should be a strong safety net that protects workers and their families. As the General Secretary of Congress, Patricia King, has said, there must be a new economic and social model based on progressive values. What No Going Back make clear as being central to this new economic and social model is the workers' voice. The part played by the low-paid and largely female workers over the course of the pandemic has been essential in getting us through it. Society owes these workers and the new economic model and social model we seek must end low-pay and precarious work that they and others have been the victims of. All households should have a minimum and sufficient level of income that enables full participation in society, while all workers should be paid at least a living wage. Quoting directly from the document here, all businesses' support measures should be linked to trade union access and recognition and full and active participation in national industrial relation machinery in both jurisdictions. This direct quote, that's a direct quote. The right to collective bargaining is the mechanism to ensure that the rights of workers are vindicated across the island. There is an imperative for the trade union movement, and that is fundamental for the trade union movement, and it's imperative to ensuring that workers are able to avail of the lifestyle and the quality of employment to which they're entitled. It's an issue for workers in Cork, every bit as much as for workers in Derry. The High Road economic model the document advocate exists in many European countries and shows that collective bargaining is consistent with high levels of productivity and strong economic performance. There is no intrinsic tension between collective bargaining and economic efficiency. Research shows that collective bargaining strength is positively associated with higher labour share and lower economic inequality. This is Congress's ambition for the whole island, and no going back spells it out in understandable and clear language. Congress in this document is calling for the establishment of the necessary legal frameworks to give expression to the worker voice in both jurisdictions. Where no going back really breaks ground is in respect to how the necessary economic stimulus and the universal expansion of public services, including the changing of social welfare to social security, as well as a just transition, are paid for. An expansion of universal basic services coupled with additional public spending arising from the crisis will necessitate a significant increase in government revenue over time. The document identifies the shortfalls in social contributions, tax revenues, and calls on those with the financial resources gained on the backs of workers to pay their fair share. Both the government in Dublin and that in London are well below the average when compared to similar European countries in terms of total spending and total revenue per person. The annual shortfalls here in these two areas are on the scale of billions. The Republic, for example, underspends in this area by under 17 billion in 2019 alone. The UK in the same year, 2019, had a funding gap of 368 billion. This is in the Republic. The entirety of that gap, that 17 billion I referred to, is explained by a lack of social contributions relative to what is typical among wealthy European countries. In other countries, these payments had a range of benefits. In other states, these payments fund a range of benefits, including sick pay, unemployment, and pensions that protect a significant amount of income up to a certain threshold. Meeting the comparator norms per person would have netted the Republic an additional 15 billion in taxation and more than covered the total tax gap of around 11 billion based on the 2018 figures. The UK sees gaps under both tax and social contribution headings amounting to an implied gap of 330 billion in 2018. I could explain in greater detail about the tax, but it's sufficient to say that the implied gaps in both cases, in both jurisdictions, are substantial at nearly 14 billion in the Republic and over 304 billion euros for the UK. This is but a flavour of what I believe is the most significant section of No Going Back in respect to supporting the case for reunifying our island. This section is both revealing and shocking, but also strangely reassuring for those of us who believe in a single island economy. It points to not only where the finance is, but it gives a clear picture of the actual sums available to be accessed where the government be persuaded to restructure our tax systems and demand of business that they pay their fair share. I've given you a brief sketch of the no going back document, and I know there are parts I have not even touched on. But for me, the key thing, in addition to the individual policy points dealt with in the document, is the point I made at the very beginning. This represents a step change in ICTU's approach to the economic and social future of the island. It is a change we will need to encourage and build upon. And in order to build, you require a foundation. And I believe this is such a foundation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jerry. That was a very good and comprehensive survey of a good and comprehensive document, which I hope will provide some kind of foundation for the type of work that we're at. And I'd like to ask Martina Devlin to make her introductory remarks.
Well, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. So, history never fails to turn, and it's turning currently. And we can be straws tossed in the wind, or we can try to shape the path ahead. I believe it's time to imagine a new Ireland. And I'd like to call it a reunion rather than a reunification or reintegration. Reunion implies absence and return, and it's a joyful meeting. So we can imagine it best with a mature debate, north and south, about what the future holds. The case for new constitutional arrangements needs to be discussed openly, and crucially, fears must be addressed. There are fears about loss of identity, about higher taxes, about diminished healthcare entitlements. A sense of the common good for everyone on this island, every citizen, regardless of how they define themselves, needs to be part of the discussion. And the trade union movement is ideally placed in this regard because it has built-in cross-community structures. It has a role to play. What was the status quo has changed beyond recognition as a result of two factors: Brexit and the pandemic. Change may have been coming anyway, but these two issues have accelerated it. I don't believe it's realistic to call for an immediate border pull, but planning for constitutional change is responsible. To my mind, the best way to proceed is within the framework of a citizens' assembly. And it should be an all-island body, cross-community, put together on a representative basis. And it should be combined with focused government-led planning to implement any changes agreed by citizens. So not just a talking shop. It's a structured discussion, a tried and tested mechanism to assess public attitudes to proposals. And here's the thing, Ireland is already a world leader in these assemblies. Our political scientists fly around the world advising on them. Some people seek to dismiss citizens' assemblies as a trendy attempt to circumvent seemingly intractable political problems. But on the contrary, they are participative democracy in action, and that's a beautiful thing. You see, we need politicians to play their part. We can't leave it all up to them as citizens. We have a role to play too. And it's essential as part of this process that we reach out with a heart and a half to unionists. A new Ireland will be born, and it makes sense for a space to be made willingly for unionists and for Britishness within that new definition of Ireland. So we need to fashion ways in which unionism can feel comfortable alongside nationalism. We need to be generous, more generous than some people might want to be, but it's a must. So, for example, we need to recognize that the tricolour, although it was devised as a symbol of unity, orange and green, we need to recognize it has baggage for unionists. It's not a flag they can rally around. And the same goes for the national anthem. So if Irish and British identities can coexist in Northern Ireland, there is surely a way to allow them to coexist in this reimagined Ireland on an equal footing. The answer lies in the Good Friday Agreement, where someone can be British or Irish or both. We need to consider too what Ulster Britishness is, and the trade union movement can help here too with its membership, some of whom define as Ulster British. So is Ulster Britishness parades and flags, or is it something else? That all has to be part of the conversation. Here's something we can do in an agreed Ireland. We can give guarantees to unionists about their place in it. Let's give them an absolute non-negotiable right to British passports if they want them, and political power, seats in the Seanad, in the Dáil, and at the cabinet table. Why not have a minister for British cultural identity, since we have a minister for the Gaeltacht, for example? This is the kind of generosity I think we need to embrace. The Republic could accept the 12th of July as a national holiday. It's important to unionist identity. Let's embrace that too. It's a long gone battle. Nobody needs to feel threatened by that. There are other conversations we need to have too about how you'd amalgamate health, education, judiciary, the civil service, the police, and workers' rights, learning from best practice internationally. A shared economy, I think it has to deliver better outcomes for all. It has to mean increased prosperity for all, increased opportunities. And that's the message I'm keen to get across, that this reunion, as I like to call it, can be advantageous to all the peoples on this island and to both parts of this island. Emotions and aspirations matter as part of this conversation, but something else matters too, and that's hard facts. So let me give you some. Northern Ireland currently is one of the UK's poorest regions. It's not working for everyone in that region. Here's another. 4 in 10 people in Northern Ireland are third level graduates, compared with 6 in 10 in the Republic. Education changes outcomes for people. There's a statistic that I find most troubling. The life expectancy for a baby born today in Northern Ireland is 1.6 years less than for a baby born in the Republic. That's according to research by ESRI economist Seamus McGuinness. And I would point out that his research has been peer reviewed in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. So just to wrap up, the idea of a new Ireland, a reimagined Ireland, is becoming more mainstream. Older people on both sides of the ideological river may be reluctant, but young people don't share those hang-ups, and we need to look to them. They must be part of the conversation. The circumstances for this conversation about our future direction as an island are not of Ireland's choosing. In some ways, they've been forced upon us by circumstances. But we can choose this. We can choose how we proceed with this change, which history has tossed our way, how to make it the best possible change that we can.
Thank you, Martina. A lot of challenging thoughts there, and we need challenging thoughts to develop the debate. But just to pick up on the last point, or the last statistic that you gave there, Patricia, Martina talked about life expectancy at 1.6 years or less than in the Republic. That obviously raises issues not just of the health service, but of public health. But as far as the broad health debate is concerned, what do you see are the barriers? What are the vested interests that stand in the way of the creation of an all-Ireland health service, however configured?
I think one of the biggest vested interests comes from those who see healthcare as a business and seek to make profit from it. So we've got the insurance companies in the Republic. We've got some of the medical profession on both sides of the border. And also, I mean, let's not forget about the fact that there has been essentially 72 years of resistance to national health service because it's seen as a form of socialism. And indeed it is. But these are all things that can be overcome.
The reason I raised the question of vested interest was because I'm conscious that many, many years ago, after the Second World War, when the first inter-party government in the Republic tried to introduce a form of a national health service, and even called it something else, the Mother and Child Scheme, they were caught in footballing parlance in a nutmeg between the Roman Catholic Church and the vested interest of the medical profession.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see the possibility of any repeat performance?
Well, we thought for a moment there that a radical decision had been taken by the Irish government when it decided to take over the private hospitals. It now emerges that what in fact they did was do a contract that will be worth about 300 million, I think, by the time the 3-month period is over. So they've just paid for beds that weren't occupied in the first place and were not totally occupied during the height of the COVID pandemic. So it wasn't just the radical move we thought it would be. But having said that, an Aaron Bevan said, I stuffed their mouths with gold. And that was the price he had to pay for the establishment of the National Health Service. It is possible to buy these people out.
Thank you. I think that is the point that was made, and been made by lots of other people, apart from an iron stuff in the mouths of the medics with gold, is the fact that it is possible. It is doable. The other question, I suppose, is this: is given the commonality of experience, particularly during the pandemic, of health workers, both in the front line support, north and south of the border, do you see the argument or the campaign for an all-Ireland health service as being a vehicle for building worker solidarity within the health service?
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, we've been working on North-South partnerships inside health for 20 odd years now. We created a North-South Health Partnership with the support of both health ministers. And I have to say in the North that then was the support of a number of subsequent health ministers. We involved all of the unions, North and South, and some of the employers. And it was successful, and it did engage in some important projects like challenging health inequalities. It pretty much went into abeyance with the collapse of social partnership in the South, really leaving us in the North to try and keep it going. But we know that if it's going to be a successful enterprise, then you've got to have political will and resourcing, and you've got to have the involvement of people on both sides of the border to make it work. The time is right to do it again, because since then we've all been engaged in different forms of industrial struggle, particularly in the health service, North and South. We have even stronger relationships with each other in the trade union movement than we did back then.
Thank you. Jerry, not just in the health service, but across the economy generally, it was quite evident during the pandemic in the ranks of all of who were categorized as essential workers. There were many, many young people there, and regrettably quite a lot of them in the position of precarious employment. Now, I know that precarious employment is highlighted within the Congress document, but how do you propose to tackle it north and south of the border within Congress?
Well, we tackle it by opposing it where we see it. We tackle it by putting forward alternatives. We tackle it by holding people to account for abusing workers. Now, that might sound quite glib, but this is not a new problem. What the pandemic has done is thrown it into sharp relief. The problem remains the same as it was pre-COVID. There are not the necessary protections in law in either jurisdiction to protect those from the unscrupulous employers who seek to exploit them. And let's face it, precarious employment is exploitation. It's pure and simple exploitation. A lot of the people in precarious employment are young people. They won't quickly forget their experience of the pandemic for a whole lot of reasons. But what they will do, because we see this in every generation, is they will learn from those experiences, and they will take that experience forward, and it will inform how they will then deal with their experience going forward. They will apply that to their experiences going forward. We in the trade union movement are challenged, particularly in respect to that, to equip and encourage those young people to not, settle for less, to take on those employers. We're there, or we will be there to support them on the ground, if you like, while at the same time pursuing the necessary legislative and cultural changes in the appropriate forums, be that as it currently is Dáil Éireann or Stormont, because trade union matters and employment matters are devolved in the north. We will, continue to do so. We continue to seek the changes that are necessary. But the most important thing here for the trade union movement is to reassure, first of all, those workers who are the victims of precarious employment, that they are not alone, and that there is a support mechanism, and there are people there who are able and willing to support them. That's the first thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do is to refocus and rededicate our efforts to overcoming precarious employment. And as I said, we do that by attacking the culture which allows it to happen. We do that by putting in place the necessary legislative frameworks. And the main thing, I suppose, that we can do is, strengthen that worker's voice through getting the bargaining structures right.
But just on that point, Jerry, has the task of strengthening bargaining structures, or if you like, providing hope to workers, particularly young workers, maybe migrant workers, that the scourge of exploitation can be tackled, has that been made worse by the recent High Court decision in Dublin, which struck if you like, statutory minimum conditions within the construction industry?
Well, yes, that court case involving the group styling itself the National Electrical Contractors of Ireland, and which was settled recently, or not settled, which judgment was handed in the High Court recently, does indeed set that process back. It is an attack on collective bargaining. It is an attack on workers' rights, and it's the people who brought this case are serial offenders. This is their second time to the courts on this sort of an issue, and it's also the third time in a decade that workers' rights have been undermined in the courts. So yes, there is a big job of work to be done there by the trade union movement, and it's one which we need to begin right away, and we need to see some action right away. So the first thing we would like to see is this decision appealed. The state has to appeal this decision because the state was a respondent here. So the state needs to appeal this, and they need to do it in a much more robust and organised fashion than they defended the case in the first place, because their performance here has been dismal. The second thing that needs to happen here is that the trade union movement needs to redouble its efforts around bringing the political class with us on this issue of workers' rights. We need to be more effective in persuading the politicians of all political parties that, well-paid workers are a good thing. Workers who are invested in, negotiating their own pay are also invested in the future and the productivity of the companies that they work in and the workplaces in which they are engaged. So the political class need to be persuaded of that. When they are persuaded of that, then the necessary protections will be put in place. Now that's both, all of that I'm after describing as a short and medium term exercise. But I can assure people that, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions is very much aware of this. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions is taking action along the lines that I've outlined here, and that we will not let go of this. Collective bargaining, workers' rights are fundamental to what we as trade unionists do, and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, I don't think will be found wanting in seeking to protect and enhance those rights.
Thanks, Jerry. Martina, in the document that Jerry referred to at the start of the meeting, is the position of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions on a whole range of issues. But central to it is that there is no going back to the old normal, and that a new future is possible. And you talked yourself about, and correctly so, about imagining a new Ireland. The issue of workers' rights and collective bargaining is identified as a problem by the Congress of Trade Unions, not just in the South, but in the North, and they see it as an all-Ireland issue. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that within the programme for government, that there is to be a new unit in the Taoiseach's office to deal with a shared island. There is a shared problem north and south of the border as far as workers' rights is concerned. Do you think that the new unit in the Taoiseach's office on the shared island, that it'll do what it says in the tin on workers' rights or in anything?
We just don't know. Micheál Martin spoke about it quite passionately in the Dáil this week. He says he has big things planned. Well, we'll just have to wait and see if that's true or if it's political spin. We just don't know. It makes sense for there to be a plan and for something to happen. The logic is for increasing links between both parts of the island, not unfastening useful ties, never more so than at a time with Brexit coming down the track. I mean, it's happening now in 5 months and there'll be all sorts of changes. COVID-19, as we've heard, underlines the logic of an island-wide public health policy. Look, I downloaded an app today, a COVID-19 app on my phone, but I was in Fermanagh and Tyrone on Sunday. So it doesn't make sense for it only to operate in 2/3 of the island. Just back to your question about Micheál Martin though, there was one very bad sign recently, and that was the nominations to the Seanad, the Taoiseach's nominations to the Seanad. It was generally believed that Ian Marshall, a voice for unionism and an effective senator in the Seanad for the past 2 years, would receive a nomination. It didn't happen. He failed to make the list. And I think that's a real error of judgment, that there's no unionist voice from the north at this time. It's imperative really now to increase links between both parts of the island and forge new ones and to maintain the ones we have, not to go untying all the links we have altogether in the Seanad. A big mistake. And by the way, Ian Marshall did really important work, initiatives aimed at job creation north and south. These initiatives don't grow on trees.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, Martina, in terms of reaching out to people, I'm conscious of the fact that in the last 20 years, there's been I would say an exponential growth, but quite a growth in people who have been born outside Ireland, who've come to live and work here. They're part of our society. They're our co-citizens. Should we, in terms of this debate, be reaching out maybe more than we have done in the past to people who come from other countries, but who have an absolute commitment to this country where they have actually chosen to come and live?
Well, it's really important to remember that there are people who don't define as orange or green nationalist or unionist, who come from elsewhere and who live on the island of Ireland and who don't necessarily know the history and aren't that interested in it, nor should they be. It's the future we need to look to, not the past. Absolutely, we should be reaching out to these groups. We should be reaching out to migrant groups and asylum seekers in Ireland. I don't hear us talking too much about travellers either, and they've traditionally crossed and crisscrossed the border and not particularly recognised any barriers there. The thing to remember is most people aren't dreaming shamrocks and harps or lambeg drums and Union Jack bunting. They're just trying to earn a living and see a better world take shape.
In that context then, as far as the trade unions for a new United Ireland are concerned, who do you think that we should be talking to?
I think we should be talking to young people primarily, because it's their future we're shaping. we should also be talking to unionists.
I
think
agree.
there should be more outreach there.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're winding to a close now, and I'm going to give you each 1 minute or less to answer the following question. And it's this, is that if you could just do, or you were allowed to do just one thing to advance the debate or the cause that we've discussed this evening, what would it be? Patricia?
Well, the people of the whole island have identified health as a #1 priority. And we have patients crossing between two systems every day. We've got to protect that, and we've got to develop that. And I think probably the most important thing around it is that we do create the fora where the kind of conversation we've started this evening continues.
Thank you. Jerry?
Well, I think the single, most important thing here about the debate is that it needs to be broadened out. We can't have the progressives and the left talking to itself about this. We can't have, it taking place effectively in a political and societal silo. It needs to involve everyone, because it's everyone's future that we're talking about. And everyone deserves to have a say. So that's what I would like to see. I would like to see the debate more mainstreamed, broadened to everyone, and opportunities for it to be debated more widely and more frequently.
Thank you. And finally, Martina?
So I think it's important to recognize that people are fearful of change. That is natural. And a key thing to do is to reassure communities. You can do this through the model of a citizens' assembly, where all those fears can be ventilated, where things like flags, anthems, national holidays, the Constitution, guarantees about identity can all be discussed and fears laid to rest. And I just really like to remind people what we need to think about is reunion of peoples, rather than worrying about terminology like reunification or reintegration of the national territory. We want an Ireland where citizens, whether orange or green or neither, have a chance to thrive.
I think that's a very positive note to end. I think this is clearly going to be a continuing debate. Trade Unionists for a New and United Ireland want to be very much part of that debate. We want to help to elevate the workers' voice within that debate, and I think tonight has been a good online start. I'd like to thank our speakers tonight, Patricia McKeown, Jerry Murphy and Martina Devon, and it only remains for me to say thank you also for logging in or listening in, or whatever the appropriate term is, and to say good night and to keep safe, because the virus is still with us and we all have to mind each other. Good night.
Good night.